My brother looked me in the eye on the funeral steps with 6 people, and he thought God watching and said, "Honey doesn't spoil sis. Neither does your little hobby. Go back to your lab and let the real farmer handle this." I smiled. I asked him one question. "How's the spring batch tasting, Logan?" He didn't understand yet why that question mattered, but a pollen chromatograph at a lab in Columbus already had the answer, 11 pages long, and with every page worse than the last. Here's what nobody standing on those church steps knew that morning. The biggest shock of that week wasn't the trust our grandfather left behind. It wasn't the lab report that proved 5 years of fraud. It was a 9-page document and a brass smoker and a choice I'd have to make at the same kitchen table where I'd once been the girl who washed the dishes while her brother got the toast. Before I continue, please like and subscribe, but only if this story finds you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments because I read every single one, and some of these stories find people at exactly the hour they need them. My name is Cora Elliston, and I am 32 years old. Let me take you back about 8 years to a farm called Elliston Hollow, 65 acres of clover and 400 hives. That was the summer I learned some families file their children the way offices file paper one, in the drawer marked legacy and one left by the thermostat where nobody looks twice. The call came on a Thursday evening in October at 6:17. I was running a pollen chromatograph at Verity Labs in Columbus. I remember the exact minute because the machine prints a timestamp on every sample. The one I never finished still sits in the archive marked incomplete. The name on my phone was not my stepmother's. It was Hector Reyes, my grandfather's head beekeeper, for 27 years. He communicated almost exclusively in nods and had never once dialed my number. "Cora," he said, and his voice sounded like he'd swallowed gravel and washed it down with nothing. "It's Edwin. He went down by the East Hives this afternoon, just walking the rows the way he does. The ambulance made it in 9 minutes." A breath. It wasn't enough minutes. I stood very still in my lab coat and watched the chromatograph hum its little green light at nobody. My grandfather was 79 years old. He had been checking queen cells when his heart stopped. He died in the grass between 2 hives he'd built with cedar from his own land, surrounded by 60,000 bees who did not know their keeper was gone. Hector cried. I thanked him for calling. It felt like a strange thing to hand a grieving man, but manners arrive before the pain does the way a receptionist arrives before the doctor. Then I sat down on the lab floor back against the cabinet where we store reference samples, and I waited for my stepmother to call me. She didn't. 4 hours later, a group text arrived. My name was on it, alongside a cousin I hadn't spoken to since a Thanksgiving I could barely place, and an uncle who lived in Tucson and sent birthday cards to the wrong month. Services, Saturday. First Methodist. 11 a.m. reception at the farmhouse. Regards, Bev. Regards. My grandfather had died in the dirt he'd loved for 4 decades, and my stepmother sent me the same text she'd send a florist confirming a delivery window. I drove home in the dark and sat on my kitchen floor. I called no one because the only person I wanted to call was the reason I was on the floor. I thought about the last thing he'd said to me at the Worthington Farmers Market in September, standing behind his folding table with 2 jars of hollow gold between us. He had the carpenter pencil behind his ear. He'd asked about my lab the way he always did, nodding in the places where the science got past him, and when I stood up to leave, he'd put his hand on the jar and said, "Honey doesn't spoil, Cora girl. It just waits for the right person to open it." I'd thought he was talking about honey. I grew up at that farm. My parents split when I was 6. My father, Theo, moved to Portland with an engineer's guilt and a custody agreement he used just often enough to keep his subscription active. Bev married him when I was 7 and sorted his 2 children into filing categories the day she moved in. Logan, 3 years older, went into the drawer marked Legacy. He got the truck at 16, the tractor seat at 14, and the introduction at every county fair. This is Logan Edwin's grandson, the one who'll take over the farm. Logan's hands were always clean. I noticed because mine were not. I went into the drawer marked Miscellaneous. I was the bee girl, the quiet one, the one who read the margins. When I was 8 years old, my grandfather took me to the East Hives on a Sunday morning and put his brass smoker into my hands. The handle was worn smooth as a river stone, and the copper belly was warm from the coals inside, and he showed me how to puff twice at the hive entrance, slow like breathing, for someone who's forgotten how. "You don't smoke them to scare them," he said, crouching beside me with his veil pushed back. "You smoke them to calm them. You're telling them you're here and you're not in a hurry." My stepmother watched from the porch with a glass of iced tea and said to my aunt on the phone loud enough to carry, "She's in her bee phase again. I give it a month." That was 24 years ago. The phase is still running, and the woman who diagnosed it never once asked what I saw when I looked inside a hive. She only ever asked why I wasn't inside the house, helping with lunch. And my grandfather, every time he walked past the hallway where my single photo hung next to the thermostat, touched the frame without breaking stride. I didn't understand the gesture until I was much older. He wasn't adjusting it. He was voting. But the woman who never called me that night had already started dividing the farm before the beekeeper was in the ground. The summer I turned 24, Bev threw Logan's 27th birthday at the farmhouse with 60 guests on monogrammed cardstock. I was not on the program. I was on the prep list. I drove the folding chairs, arranged 14 centerpieces, and Saturday morning I was dicing onions at 6:15 when Bev handed me an apron without looking at me, the way you'd hang a coat on a hook. The toast came at 7. Bev stood at the head of the picnic table under the string lights I'd spent 2 hours hanging, put her hand on Logan's shoulder, and introduced him to everyone who already knew him. "This is the future of Elliston Hollow, Edwin's grandson, the one who'll carry it forward." Logan grinned. He was good at grinning. It was his primary agricultural skill. He wore a barn coat that still had the tags tucked inside the collar, and he talked about the land the way a man talks about a car he test drove once. Phrases like soil management and sustainable yield that I recognized from a podcast he'd binged the week before because I'd heard it through his bedroom wall. 60 people clapped. I stood at the sink with onion on my hands and dish soap under my nails and watched through the kitchen window. And my grandfather came in through the back screen door, letting it bang behind him the way he did when he wanted you to know he was arriving. And he found me at the basin with my hands in the water. He didn't say anything about the toast. He picked up a dish towel, dried a glass I'd already dried, set it down and said, "The hive doesn't need the loudest bee Cora girl. It needs the one who knows where the queen is." Then he folded the towel into a square, hung it on the oven handle, and walked back outside to his own grandson's coronation party. And I stood there with my hands dripping and understood for the first time that my grandfather was not a quiet man. He was a precise one. He said exactly as many words as the truth required, and the truth that evening required 12. I left Granger 3 weeks later. Not in anger, in arithmetic. I'd run the numbers on what that house would cost me if I stayed, and the total was my whole life. The morning I told Bev I was leaving, she was watering the porch ferns and didn't turn around. "Well," she said, adjusting a nozzle, "I suppose somebody has to try the city." The way she said try, you'd have thought Columbus was a diet she expected me to quit by Thanksgiving. I packed 2 bags and a box of lab notebooks. I didn't leave a note because the only person who would read it didn't need one, and the people who needed one wouldn't read it. My grandfather was standing at the hive gate when I pulled out at dawn. He didn't wave me down. He raised one hand and held it steady against the sky. I watched it stay in my rearview mirror until the road bent past the silo and took him out of the frame. I cried until the county line and then stopped. I had $1,100, a used Honda, with a slow leak in the rear tire and no plan, and crying costs concentration you can't afford at highway speed. Columbus is 2.5 hours from Granger, which is close enough to drive back and far enough that nobody expects you to. I rented a room over a vacuum repair shop and worked 3 jobs while studying for my food science certification. I did my studying at the laundromat on 5th because the fluorescent lights never turned off and nobody bothered a woman with a textbook at midnight. It took me 2 years. My supervisor, Dr. Lena Goss, shook my hand on the last day and said, "You have the best sample eye I've trained in 15 years. Don't waste it somewhere safe." Verity Labs hired me the month I finished. Within 2 years, I was running pollen chromatography. It is the discipline that tells you not just what's in a jar of honey, but where every grain of pollen originated, what continent it came from, and whether the label is telling the truth. I built their Midwest reference database cataloging 200 farms across 14 states. My stepmother told her garden club I worked in a lab somewhere, doing something with microscopes. And the way Bev said microscopes, you'd have thought it was a lesser brand of vacuum cleaner. And my grandfather came twice a year in fall and spring. He'd drive to the Worthington Farmers Market with a truckload of hollow gold, and without telling Bev or Logan, he'd find me. We'd sit on overturned crates behind the booth. He'd hand me a jar and watch my face while I held it to the light, checking the color. The clarity, the slow tilt of real honey, like it had somewhere important to be. He never asked about Logan, never asked about Bev. How's the lab Cora girl? They treating you right? And he'd leave a honey label on the crate, my name in carpenter pencil in the corner, the way he wrote every customer's child's name on a jar. I was somebody's grandchild on a label. For 8 years, that was the whole of my family. And every season in my apartment mailbox, between the electric bill and the grocery circulars, a postcard. Hand-painted, a little crooked. Always a different wildflower. On the back, in a looping script that smelled faintly of kiln dust and turpentine. Still here, still weird, still yours? My great-aunt Felicity Edwin's younger sister, the family's official misfit, the woman who made pottery in a cabin at the edge of the farm, and whom Bev referred to only as your grandfather's sister in a tone that suggested a diagnosis rather than a relation. Fee never told me what to do. She just kept proving she existed. Postcard by postcard, season by season, the way a lighthouse doesn't chase the ship but never stops turning. I built a career on telling real honey from fake. I had no idea how soon that skill would come home. We drove into Granger on Wednesday afternoon. The town had done what small towns do when they're waiting for someone to die, and someone finally does. The flag at the hardware store was at half-staff. The dairy freeze had taped a handwritten sign to the window. "We'll miss you, Edwin. The clover batch was always our favorite." The banner over Main Street still read, Granger Fall Festival, October 11 through 13. 3 weeks passed. In Granger, banners come down when somebody gets around to it, and nobody ever does. I drove to the farm first. I needed the hives before I could handle the house. The gate was open, which was wrong. My grandfather closed that gate every night at sundown the way other men lock their front doors, and seeing it standing wide felt like finding a sentence with no period. But what was waiting past it nearly broke me in a way I wasn't ready for on a Wednesday. The crew was standing along the fence line, all 9 of them. Hector in front, hat off, old Sullivan from the extraction shed 71 and still claiming he'd retire. And when my car crunched up the drive, every one of them took off his hat. Nobody does that for a girl who left town 8 years ago. They did it for Edwin Elliston's granddaughter. Hector hugged me like a bag of cement and walked me to the east hives, where a single frame of honeycomb sat on the inspection bench, half drawn. Somebody had set a jar of wildflowers next to it. Nobody had moved the frame. "We didn't know if we should finish it," Hector said, looking at the bench the way you look at a clock that's stopped. "Leave it," I said. "I'll do it." And we both let that sentence sit there like it was normal. I carried my bag up to the loft room, over the farm office, and stopped at the metal desk. My ledger system was still running the place. 8 years. My grandfather had never switched to software, never hired a bookkeeper, never even changed the column headers. I'd drawn with a ruler when I was 19. My handwriting was still in the margins, and next to it, in carpenter pencil, his. He'd been keeping my books the whole time I was gone, entering numbers in my system like a man watering someone else's garden, because the garden still worked and because the gardener might come home. I sat at that desk for 11 minutes. I know because the clock on the wall was the same one that had been there when I was 17, the one with the bee on the second hand, that went around and around like a small faith that never got tired. I drove the 12 minutes to Bev's house that evening, and she opened the door already in performance. "Cora, sweetheart," she said, arms wide volume, pitched for the neighbor's porch. She folded me into a hug that lasted exactly as long as a neighbor might be watching, and released me the instant the porch light next door clicked off. Inside, with the door shut, the temperature dropped. She stepped back and inventoried me the way she checks the gardenias for aphids. "You've kept your weight down. That's something." That was the grief counseling. My grandfather had been dead for 38 hours. The photo wall had been rearranged. 15 frames of Logan, now including a new one from a farm equipment expo, where he stood behind someone else's tractor, posing as a man who works the land. My photo by the thermostat was gone. In its place, a small watercolor of a barn that Bev had bought at a church auction for $8. Bev talked for 40 minutes without mentioning my grandfather by name. The flowers were being shipped from Cleveland because local reads small. The club was doing a buffet, and everyone was coming. She recited the guest list like a stock ticker. Not a single story about the man whose funeral she was staging. When I asked how she was holding up, she straightened to Lily and said, "The Lord doesn't hand us more than we can carry, Cora." Then she told me Logan was driving in from Cincinnati Thursday morning. The poor boy is devastated. He's been handling all the arrangements. What arrangements? I asked, since she'd just claimed every one of them. And for half a second, my stepmother's eyes went to the kitchen counter, to a slim green folder sitting next to the bread box. A folder with a small mountain logo on the tab green ink on white, and 3 letters I could read from 8 feet away. G-A-A. Green Arc Agri. I knew that logo. I'd seen it on invoices at Verity Labs. We'd certified 4 of their subsidiary farms last year. Industrial pollination operations, monoculture, honey, the kind of product my grandfather would have used as a cautionary tale. Bev turned the folder face down before she answered me. "Oh, just odds and ends," she said, and poured me a cup of decaf I hadn't asked for, and changed the subject to the string quartet she'd booked for the reception, because grief apparently needed a soundtrack in B-flat. I drank the coffee. I looked at the counter where the folder had been. Being a pollen analyst trains you to spot what doesn't belong in a sample. The foreign grain, the imported signature, the thing that tells you the jar is lying. That folder had a logo I recognized, and the woman who flipped it over didn't know I'd spent 3 years certifying companies exactly like the one inside it. Thursday morning was the funeral planning breakfast. Bev called it 90 minutes of her reading decisions off a legal pad while the pastor nodded, and Logan ate his second cinnamon roll without contributing a syllable. The service would be a celebration of life at First Methodist. Programs on cardstock cream, not white, because white reads cheap. String quartet during the processional. A photo board curated by Bev. And the eulogy she announced would be delivered by Logan. She straightened her reading glasses the way a conductor lifts a baton. I set down my coffee cup with a precision I want noted. "What about me?" Bev looked at me over those glasses. The look had a particular geometry to it, the same tilt she used when a salesperson showed her a garment in the wrong fabric. "Sweetheart," she said, "you've been gone 8 years. Half the church doesn't even know you anymore. Logan's been here. He's the one people associate with the farm. It would just confuse things." There it was. The family constitution in one clause. The person who left forfeits the microphone. The person who stayed owns the story. It did not matter that the person who stayed couldn't tell clover honey from corn syrup without reading the label. I said, "He calls him Pops, Bev. Grandpa hated Pops. He said it sounded like a gas station." Logan looked up from his cinnamon roll. "He never told me that." "He told you," I said. "You weren't listening. There's a difference." Bev closed her legal pad with a click that ended the discussion the way a period ends a sentence. She slid a shoebox of blank thank you cards across the table to me. 200 cards, cream stock matching the programs. I took the box because the reflex was faster than the dignity, and I want you to watch that reflex because this whole story turns on the distance between what I should have said and what I did instead. The obituary went out Thursday night to a family group text I'd been quietly re-added to, like a magazine subscription nobody remembers ordering. Logan wrote it, or Bev wrote it, and gave him the send button, which amounts to the same signature. It called him a beloved patriarch and green thumb enthusiast. My grandfather, who had bred a clover varietal that bore his name, in the state agricultural registry, reduced to a hobbyist with good soil. The second paragraph crowned Logan as devoted grandson who worked alongside Edwin every day, which was generous since the fuel logs showed his truck averaging 11 miles a day. You don't get to the back 40 on 11 miles. You get to the coffee maker and back. And their wedge between a great-uncle in Tucson and the church board membership was my entire existence, also survived by a granddaughter, Cora of Columbus. 11 letters and a comma, and they'd managed to make me sound like an afterthought the copy editor missed. I read it 4 times. Then I replied to the group with one edit not about me. I asked them to add founder of Elliston Hollow and creator of the Hollow Gold brand after Grandpa's name, because the obituary about a man who built a 65-acre apiary from a single colony and a borrowed truck had somehow failed to mention either. Logan texted back a thumbs-up emoji. 20 minutes later, the final version posted to the funeral home website. My edit was gone. Grandpa stayed a green thumb enthusiast. I stayed in the subordinate clause between the uncle and the church board, surviving also as though existence itself were a consolation prize I'd been handed at the door. If you've ever opened a family announcement and found your whole life compressed into a dependent clause behind a great-uncle's name, tell me about it in the comments. And subscribe, because what my quiet grandfather did about all of this is coming, and I promise you it's better than anything I could have written into that obituary. Saturday, funeral morning. I arrived at First Methodist early. Somebody has to hold the door before the performance starts, and that somebody is never the people in the good car. I greeted every mourner on the steps. 3 decades of customers whose children's names were written on jar labels in a dead man's pencil. Granger had not forgotten me. It had simply filed me in a drawer nobody opened until today. At 10:38, Logan stepped out of a silver SUV in a barn coat so new the creases were still from the store. His wife Tanya followed quiet, careful, and Bev emerged in navy silk with sunglasses despite a sky the color of wet cement. Logan reached me at the top step. He looked at my coat, my flat shoes, my bare wrist. He took in the inventory and arrived at a total that satisfied him. Then he leaned down, squeezed my shoulder, the way you'd test a melon, and said it loud enough for the 5 people behind him to catch every word. "Honey doesn't spoil sis. Neither does your little hobby." A grin wide and practiced. "Go back to your lab and let the real farmer handle this." 6 people heard it. 2 of them laughed the short, polite kind that isn't agreement, but isn't objection either. Bev smiled at the steps, the soft, diplomatic smile of a woman who has just watched her investment outperform the index. And Tanya looked at the railing and said nothing, which I filed under a column I'd opened for her without knowing why. I did not answer Logan on those steps. A pollen analyst doesn't argue with contamination. She documents it, bags the sample, and waits for the chromatograph to do the talking. But I want you to remember that phrase of his word for word, because 6 days later he'd hear it again at his grandfather's kitchen table, and the voice saying it would be mine. Inside the church, Logan gave the eulogy from a leather folder. He called Grandpa Pops 11 times and told a fishing story that belonged to a neighbor. Not one photo on the board showed Edwin with wax under his nails. In the 4th row, Hector's jaw worked slow and steady, grinding every borrowed word to dust between his teeth. But I didn't go back to my lab, because that evening I heard something through a kitchen door that changed every number in my ledger. I drove back to Bev's house Friday evening to return the thank you cards. The hallway smelled like roast chicken and lilies left too long in warm water. I heard voices in the kitchen before I reached it. The door was open the width of a hymnal, and through that gap I could see the oak table, and open between 2 coffee cups the green folder. I stood very still and listened. A pollen analyst is trained to hold position while the chromatograph runs. You don't rush the reading, you wait. Bev's voice first in the crisp tone she used for church committee scheduling. Greenark's letter of intent expires end of the quarter. Kirk says 65 acres of road frontage on Route 12 doesn't sit on the market a week. Once probate clears, we sign. Kirk. I'd learn the full name later. Kirk Jessup Greenark's regional land acquisitions manager. He'd seen 400 beehives and 40 years of clover varietal breeding, and he calculated $1 per acre number the way you'd price a parking lot. Logan's voice next. Slower, heavier, the voice of a man doing math he doesn't want anyone to check. And the crew, a spoon against China. Bev stirring without urgency. Severance is standard. Hector will land somewhere. He's resourceful. Resourceful? 27 years of loyalty, and she'd been assigned a 2-syllable coffin. Then Logan asked the question I will hear for the rest of my life. Quieter than the others, as if volume could soften the blade. And Cora, my stepmother, did not stop stirring. Cora will be reasonable, she said. She always is. I understood three things in the space of one breath. They were selling the farm to an industrial agriculture company before the wildflowers on his grave had opened. They had a timeline, a broker, and a folder. And they had already assigned me my part, the reasonable one, the useful one, the girl who doesn't make a scene. I did not push open that door. A bookkeeper confronts at the audit, not in a hallway. I walked out and called nobody. First, I needed to know one thing, whether my grandfather had left more than a folder behind. I drove back to the farm in the dark and went straight to the office. Hector was there, sitting in the desk chair with a cold coffee and the overhead off. He told me two things, embarrassed as though they were his fault. The crew's end-of-month paycheck hadn't cleared. The bank had frozen the operating account the day Bev reported the death. Standard procedure, no malice, just paperwork, doing what paperwork does when a name stops breathing. But 9 families were short a week's wages, the same week they'd carried a man they loved on their shoulders. And Green Arc hadn't waited for decency. Fresh survey stakes with pink ribbon lined the back, 40 planted Wednesday, authorized by Mrs. Elliston. Somebody had been measuring the land while we were mourning the man who'd walked it. I wrote Hector a personal check to cover all 9 paychecks. Then I opened the books. And let me tell you what the ledger said, because everything Bev and Logan would claim in the coming week depended on nobody reading it. Elliston Hollow was not struggling. February margins were thin, but the trailing 12 months ran profitable. Equipment was paid off. The Hollow Gold wholesale accounts were steady: 34 farm stores, 6 co-ops, 2 regional grocery chains. Selling this place wasn't rescue, it was liquidation, and the only debt in the picture wasn't the farm's, it was Logan's. $120,000 in personal losses from a collapsed cryptocurrency platform called Cedar Block Capital. My brother had gambled his way into a hole the exact shape of a 65-acre farm, and the only shovel that fit was my grandfather's land. But it was the purchase ledger that stopped me cold. 5 years of entries, once a quarter in Logan's hand, bulk honey imported from consolidated apiaries, quantities that didn't match our hive count, prices per pound that were a third of what single-origin clover costs to produce, and on the sales side, every ounce of it recorded as Hollow Gold organic estate produced. I sat at my grandfather's desk at 1 a.m, and I let the numbers say what they said. For 5 years, my brother had been buying cheap imported honey, blending it into Hollow Gold, and selling it under a label my grandfather had spent 40 years building one hive at a time. Stay with me, because the beekeeper's granddaughter just found something in the numbers that even the beekeeper didn't catch. And what was waiting on my voicemail was about to put every one of those numbers on a table nobody could leave. Around 2 a.m, I opened a desk drawer looking for a pencil and found instead a rubber-banded stack of honey labels, and I had to sit down. 2 names, every season. In Carpenter pencil, the same careful block letters he used on customer jars. Hollow Gold Cora's batch, Hollow Gold Logan's batch. Both names every spring, every fall for 8 years. Whatever he'd decided about his grandchildren, he had not decided it in anger. He'd kept writing both names into the orders the way a man keeps setting 2 plates at a table even when one chair is empty. I held the label with my name on it and pressed my thumb across the pencil letters until the graphite smudged warm against my skin. I thought you stubborn, quiet, impossible man. You were still counting me. 5 years of fake honey sold under my grandfather's name, and the phone call waiting on my voicemail was about to hand me the blade. I played the voicemail at 2:47 in the morning, sitting on the loft bed with my grandfather's label still warm in my hand. A woman's voice steady and unhurried. The cadence of someone who measures words the way I measure pollen grains. Ms. Elliston, this is Margot Yoon. I'm an attorney here in Granger. Your grandfather was my client. He left specific instructions that I speak with you before any estate proceedings move forward. Monday morning, 10 o'clock, my office on Cedar Street. Please come alone first. He was very particular about the order. Very particular about the order. That sounded like him. He was not a man who left things to chance. He was a man who left things to structure, which is the quiet person's version of control. I called Margot at 8 the next morning. She told me 3 things in a voice that gave away nothing extra. 1. My grandfather had executed a revocable living trust in March of 2023 after a cardiac episode he'd hidden from everyone except his doctor. 2. All beneficiaries would be notified and invited to a reading on Monday. 3. She could not discuss the contents, but she wanted me to know the document was not an accident. I sat very still, then made 3 phone calls. The first was to Anita Rojas, my colleague at Verity Labs, and the best pollen chromatographer I've ever worked with. I told her I was sending 3 jars of hollow gold from the farm's current inventory, different batch dates across the last 2 years, and I needed a full pollen origin analysis on each. Standard protocol chain of custody results on letterhead. I asked her to run them as outside samples, not through my account, so the analysis would be independent. She asked if this was personal. I said, "It's honey." She said, "It's always honey with you, Cora," and took the case number. The second call was to the UPS store on Main Street. I packed the 3 jars with enough bubble wrap to survive a hurricane, wrote Anita's lab address on the label, and paid for overnight shipping. $47. The most important $47 I've ever spent. The third call was to no one. I sat on the edge of the loft bed and held the brass smoker in both hands. I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd found in the books downstairs. My brother had been poisoning my grandfather's name for 5 years, jar by jar, batch by batch. My grandfather had died without knowing it. And this thought arrived like a cold draft under a door he had known. And that knowing had been part of what stopped his heart in the East Hive Row on a Thursday afternoon. I sat on that bed with the smoker in my lap, the copper belly cold. No coals, no warmth, just the weight of a tool that had outlived the hand that used it. I cried the way you cry when you finally find the error in a spreadsheet you've been trusting for years. Not loud, not performative, just the specific grief of discovering that the numbers were wrong and somebody you loved had been paying the difference. That was my one breakdown. I'm recording it here because I want you to know I'm not a machine. I'm a woman who sat on a dead man's bed and held his smoker, missing him, with a force that had a physical shape. Then I washed my face and went back to work because that is what the women in this story do. We feel it all, and then we file it, and then we stand up. Friday evening. Bev caught my arm in the farmhouse hallway and dropped the hostess voice. "This lawyer woman. Yun. She called me about Monday. I don't know what Edwin was thinking, but Tom Hargrove handled all our affairs for 30 years. I said Tom Hargrove retired in 23, Bev. She blinked once, recalibrating. Well, whatever this paperwork is. The important thing is that the family presents a united front. She squeezed my arm, twice the same 2 taps she'd used my whole childhood to mean we've agreed, haven't we? I'll be there at 10, I said. That was all I said. Saturday I drove to the Worthington Farmers Market alone, not to buy anything, to stand behind the empty space where my grandfather's folding table had been every fall Saturday for 40 years. An older woman in a fleece vest stopped beside me. She was holding a jar of someone else's honey, reading the label with the squint of a person who knows what she's lost. "You're Edwin's girl," she said. "I drove 45 minutes for his spring batch every year since '98. There's nothing like it on the market." She looked at the jar in her hand. "This one doesn't taste right. Hasn't for a while, honestly." I looked at her. She looked at me. And neither of us said what we were both thinking because some truths need a lab report before they're allowed to leave the building. Monday morning. 9 pages were going to rearrange this family, but I had 11 more of my own. Monday morning, 10 o'clock, and the kitchen table at Elliston Hollow held more truth per square foot than it had in 30 years. My grandfather built that table himself, white oak joined without nails. Every scratch on its surface was a meal someone had eaten in the company of someone they loved or were pretending to love. Margot Yoon arrived at 9:45 with a briefcase and the unhurried posture of a woman who had read every page twice. She sat up at the head of the table, a glass of water, no ice, a pen she didn't need, and 9 pages in a manila folder. Bev arrived at 9:52 in navy, Logan and Tanya flanking her. Logan wore a green tie, knotted too tight, the kind of tie that's doing all the work. Tanya sat 1 chair apart from him. My father Theo took the chair nearest the window, farthest from Bev, hands folded with the geometry of a man who has practiced not being in the way. Fee came through the back door, last slightly sideways, holding 2 mugs of coffee. One for herself, one she set in front of me without a word. She took the corner chair and crossed her ankles and waited with the patience of a woman who already knew the weather report. Margot opened the folder. She read the way my grandfather built hives, clean joints, no wasted wood. The Edwin Elliston Revocable Living Trust, executed March 14th, 2023. Item: the house on Orchard Lane, Beverly Elliston to have full use of the residence for the remainder of her natural life. Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance to be paid by the trust. Monthly income to be deposited on the 1st of each month into Mrs. Elliston's personal account. Margot glanced up. Edwin was explicit that Mrs. Elliston should never worry about money. Those were his words to me. He repeated them. Bev nodded. The slow, gracious nod of a woman accepting what she considers the minimum appropriate tribute. Her shoulders settled half an inch, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes, recalibrating toward comfort. Item: investment and savings accounts valued at approximately $740,000 to be divided equally between his 2 grandchildren, Logan Elliston and Cora Elliston. Logan's jaw unclenched. Tanya's hand moved an inch toward his on the table and stopped. $370,000 apiece. I watched my brother do the math against his debt and arrive at a number that let him breathe. I filed that breath under a column I'd opened for him the night I found his crypto ledger. Then Margot turned the page and the room turned with it. Item: Elliston Hollow Farm and apiary inclusive of all land structures, equipment, livestock, and the registered trademark Hollow Gold, to be held in trust for a period of not less than 15 years. The trust property shall not be sold, mortgaged, leased, subdivided, or transferred in any form during the trust period. Sole authority over the operation and management of the farm and the use of the Hollow Gold trademark is vested in the successor trustee. Margot set down the page. Edwin named his granddaughter Cora as successor trustee. The room did 4 things at once. Bev's chin turned toward me with the slow mechanical certainty of a surveillance camera picking out its target. Logan said, "That's a mistake," in the bright clipped voice of a man correcting a scoreboard. Tanya looked down at her own hands. My father at the window closed his eyes for exactly 1 breath and opened them again. I realized he was not surprised. He was relieved. Logan stood up, palms flat on the oak. "She hasn't been here in 8 years. I've been running this place. I'm the one who shows up every day. Ask Hector. Ask anyone." Inside, it was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in my grandfather's carpenter pencil on lined notebook paper, the kind you buy at the drugstore for $1.50. She did not pick it up. She knew it by heart. "He anticipated the objection," she said. "He asked me to read this sentence aloud if anyone challenged the appointment. The garden goes to the one who tends it, not the one who stands at the gate." Quiet. The specific quiet of a room where someone has just been measured from the far side of the grave and found short by a man who counted everything. My grandfather, who never raised his voice in 79 years, had written 1 sentence on drugstore paper, and it landed harder than anything Logan's leather folder eulogy had managed in 20 minutes. Bev stood, smoothed her skirt with both hands. "Margot," she said, and the name came out stripped to the bolts. A word, outside. "The trust is irrevocable upon the grantor's death, Mrs. Elliston. There's nothing a word outside would change." My stepmother looked at me then, really looked, and what I saw in her face was not anger, it was inventory. She was repricing me. During the break, my father found me on the back porch. He stood beside me, looking out at the east hives where the morning sun was hitting the boxes the way it did every day. "Cora," he said. He opened his mouth again. The words weren't the ones he had planned. "I should have—" He stopped, looked down at his shoes. Good shoes. Portland shoes. Shoes that had never stood in this dirt when it mattered. "I know, Dad," I said. He nodded. We stood there. The bees flew their patterns. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was forgiven. Some silences between a father and daughter are not empty. They are full of things. Neither has the tools to unpack. They're full. They're just full of things. Neither person has the tools to unpack on a Monday morning on a porch. If you're still here, hit subscribe because the trust was only the first page. What I put on that table next is the part nobody saw coming, not even Logan, and especially not the man from Green Ark who thought he was buying a farm. The trust locked the land, but the land wasn't the only thing my brother had been selling. We came back to the table. Margot had not moved. Her water glass was still full, her pen still untouched, and the 9 pages sat in the same position, patient as a clock with nowhere to be. Bev smoothed into her chair with the composure of a woman who has spent the break not grieving, but strategizing. She placed both hands on the table, fingers laced. "Well," she said, "this is a lot to absorb, but the important thing is that we move forward as a family." She turned her head toward the front door. "Kirk is waiting outside. He's been very patient, and Green Ark's offer has a deadline that doesn't care about probate schedules." Margot looked at her pen, which remained untouched, and the fact she hadn't lifted it told me she wasn't finished with this yet. "Mrs. Elliston," Margot said, "the trust property cannot be sold. I've explained this. Trusts can be amended." Bev said, "if all beneficiaries agree." She said agree the same way she said family, like a gate with a lock, only she held the key to. Logan leaned forward. "Look, this is Grandpa being sentimental. The farm needs real management, and Cora hasn't set foot on this property in 8. "Before we continue," I said. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope, then set it on the oak next to Margot's folder. The sound on the wood was the lightest thing in the room, and somehow the loudest. "I have a lab report," I said. Margot nodded once. She'd known this was coming. Not the contents, but the fact that I'd come prepared. I think my grandfather had told her that about me. I opened the envelope and set 11 pages on the table. Verity Labs letterhead. Pollen chromatography analysis. 3 samples, full spectral breakdown. Signed by Anita Rojas, senior analyst. It wasn't signed by me. Objectivity needed someone else's name. "These are the results of a pollen origin analysis on 3 jars of hollow gold taken from the farm's current inventory," I said. "Different batch dates, 2 from last year, 1 from 22. I let them look at the cover page. Nobody reached for it. All 3 samples contain between 60 and 83% pollen, consistent with non-domestic origin. Argentine soybean, Chinese rapeseed, Malaysian palm flower. The samples are not consistent with single-origin clover honey produced in northeastern Ohio. None of the 3 would qualify for organic certification under USDA National Organic Program standards." Silence. The accounting kind. The silence of a room where a number has just landed and everyone is trying to figure out which column it belongs in. For approximately 5 years, imported bulk honey purchased from a broker called Consolidated Apiaries has been blended into hollow gold inventory and sold under Grandpa's label as a state-produced, single-origin, organic clover honey. The purchase records are in the farm's books. The entries are not in Grandpa's handwriting. I did not look at Logan when I said this. Every pair of eyes in the room did it for me. Margot picked up her pen for the first time. She opened the trust document to page 7 and read with the unhurried certainty of a woman reading a property line that isn't going to move. Section 14, subsection C. The hollow gold trademark shall be used exclusively for honey products meeting independent organic certification standards from an accredited laboratory. Any use of the trademark on products failing to meet this standard shall constitute a material breach, and all rights to the trademark shall revert automatically to the trust effective upon documentation of the breach. The clause is self-executing. She set the pen down. She looked at Logan. "The lab results are the documentation, Mr. Elliston. The clause has already triggered. As of this morning, use of the hollow gold trademark, without the trustee's authorization, is a violation of the trust instrument. I don't need anyone's permission. Neither does the chromatograph." Logan's chair scraped backward. I was cutting costs. The margins were impossible. Mom said, the word hit Bev like a bird against a window. "I never told you to cheat," she said, aimed at Logan, but meant for Margot. "I said reduce expenses." You signed off on the batch sheets every quarter, Mom. I signed what you put in front of me. You read everything. You read the sympathy cards before you fan them. The machinery ate its own gears. Tanya stood, picked up her keys, walked to the door, and closed it behind her without a sound. That click was the most complete sentence anyone had spoken all morning. Kirk from Green Arc appeared in the doorway, read the room, closed his folder. We'll need to reassess, he said, and walked out without shaking a single hand. Logan turned to me. You planned this? You and your lab and your little microscope hobby. I reached into my bag one more time. I took out the brass smoker and I set it on the table next to the lab report. The copper was cold. The handle was worn silver where my grandfather's palm had ridden it every morning for 40 years. And it sat there on the oak he'd built small and heavy and completely silent, and it said everything I wasn't going to. You're right, Logan, I said. Honey doesn't spoil, it just waits. I looked at him. So does the truth. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. My stepmother stared at the smoker like a woman who has just discovered a receipt she can't explain. And Fee, in her corner chair, lifted her coffee mug and took a slow sip, and the only expression on her face was the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has watched a garden come up exactly the way it was planted. Drop honey in the comments if you've ever watched The Truth. Do the work you didn't have to, because the folder closed, the deal died, and for the first time in 30 years, that kitchen table was honest. 3 weeks passed. A family can rearrange itself so completely you'd think the furniture had always been in the new positions, except for the marks on the carpet. Green Arc withdrew formally. The survey stakes came out without an apology for the holes. Logan's world contracted the way a hive shrinks before winter. Tanya filed for separation. The crypto debt didn't disappear. $120,000 is patient. Logan sold his truck and moved into the apartment above the feed store, $400 a month. The landlord called me as a reference and asked if Logan Elliston was reliable. I said, he's working on it. Bev stopped speaking to me, not with an announcement. She simply stopped returning calls and began telling the garden club her version, which I'm told involves an ungrateful granddaughter and a confused old man who didn't know what he was signing. I let her keep it. She needs that story more than I need the correction. My father flew back to Portland the Wednesday after the reading. At the airport, standing in the drop-off lane with his carry-on, he said, Your grandfather saw you, Cora, the whole time. I want you to know I saw you too. I just didn't have his... He stopped, looked at the terminal doors. His courage. He finished, and the word cost him something. I could see in the way his hand tightened on the bag strap. I hugged him. He hugged back with both arms, which was new and held on for 4 seconds longer than any hug we'd shared in 26 years. I counted. Old habit. Hector became general manager. I drew up the paperwork myself, raised his salary, and put his title on the door. He read the offer letter at his desk and said, Your grandfather would have done this 10 years ago if your grandmother had let him. And then he said, She would have been wrong, which was the most words I'd ever heard Hector spend on a dead woman's management style. The crew got back pay for the frozen week and a bonus from the trust. I calculated it to the penny because I am constitutionally incapable of rounding. Old Sullivan told me he'd stay 1 more year. Then he told me the same thing the following month. I think he'll tell me every month until one of us stops showing up, and I suspect it won't be him. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the reading, Logan came to the farm. I was in the extraction shed checking the centrifuge calibration. I heard boots on the gravel outside, slow and uneven, the walk of a man who is not sure the ground will hold him. I stepped out, and there was my brother, standing on the far side of the hive gate with his hands in his jacket pockets. No barn coat, no green tie, no performance. Just a man in a jacket that fit him, and jeans that had dirt on them, actual dirt from actual ground. He didn't come through the gate. He stood on the other side of it like a man at a border crossing who has left his passport in another life. I'm not here to fight, he said. He looked at the hives behind me, the east row, the ones where our grandfather's heart had stopped between 2 cedar boxes on a Thursday that smelled like clover and felt like an ending. And my brother said the truest thing I have ever heard him say. Do you know what it costs to be her favorite? He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the hives. You got to leave Cora. I never did. I've been up on that wall since I was 6 years old, the future of Elliston Hollow, the one who carries it forward. And there's no ladder down from that frame that doesn't break her. It was not an apology. He didn't say sorry. Not for the fake honey, not for the eulogy, not for the phrase on the church steps. And I didn't offer forgiveness because neither of us had brought those items to the counter. But he reached into his jacket and set something on the gatepost between us. A jar of honey, small, maybe 8 ounces. The label was handwritten, not in carpenter pencil, in ballpoint Logan's handwriting, shaky and unpracticed. Hollow Gold Logan's batch. Batch 1. I looked at that jar for a long time. Batch 1. Not a promise, not an apology, just a number, and a number is a start. I went into the office and came back with a small paper label. Carpenter pencil. I wrote his name in the corner, the way our grandfather wrote every customer's child's name, careful letters, unhurried. I put it on the gatepost next to his jar. I'm not closing the gate, Logan, but I'm the one who decides when it opens how wide and who walks through. He picked up the label. His thumb moved once across the pencil letters. He put it in his pocket and he drove back toward town. I stood at the gate and watched his taillights until the road bent past the silo and took him out of the frame, the same bend that had taken me out of my grandfather's mirror 8 years ago. That evening I found a small arrangement of wildflowers on the extraction shed steps. No card, but taped to the jar that held them a note, "Your grandfather would be proud. So is Main Street. Ada Kessler. Kessler Florals, established 1987. She was a woman I'd never met, who ran a shop I'd walked past 100 times, and had decided a stranger needed to know the town was paying attention, even when the family wasn't. If someone in your family only showed up after the numbers changed, I need to hear your story. Tell me in the comments. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, I learned what home actually sounds like. It sounds like this. A Sunday morning in late April, 5 months after a man died, between 2 hives he built with cedar from his own land, and the farm he left behind is open for the season, I wake at 4:50, not because an alarm tells me to, because something in this house, in the floorboards, or the light, or the particular silence of an apiary before the bees start flying, has reset my clock to his. I make 2 cups of coffee. I drink one at the kitchen sink, standing looking out the window at the East Hive row, where the sun is just reaching the first box. The second cup I carry with me through the morning rounds. It goes cold in my hand within 20 minutes, and I hold it anyway, because holding it feels like a break, even when I'm working, and now I understand why he did that for 40 years. The hives are awake before I reach them. That low collective hum, 60,000 small decisions being made at once by creatures who have never held a meeting about it. I pull the veil down and light the smoker. 2 puffs at the entrance, slow. You're telling them you're here and you're not in a hurry. The brass smoker hangs on his hook by the hive gate now. I take it down every morning and put it back every evening. The handle is warm from my hand by the time it goes home, and I think eventually the wear pattern will change from his palm to mine. I think he'd be all right with that. Fee comes up the path at 7 with 2 mugs. She has never once asked whether I want coffee. She brings it the way weather arrives without negotiation. We sit on the bench outside the extraction shed, the one old Sullivan built last month from scrap oak he claimed he found, but definitely purchased. We drink without talking for the first 10 minutes because Fee believes, and I have come to agree, that the first 10 minutes of coffee are between you and the cup, and anyone who interrupts is committing a misdemeanor. The clover's coming in early, she says, looking at the south field where the white heads are just starting to nod in the breeze. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, I say. Grandpa would have had the supers on already. Your grandpa was early for his own birth, Fee says. Your grandmother complained about it until the day she died, said he showed up 2 weeks before the due date and never once waited for anything again. She takes a sip. I take a sip. A bee lands on the rim of her mug, investigates, finds nothing worth reporting, and leaves. Fee watches it go with the expression of a woman who has been surrounded by bees for 57 years and has never once been stung. The farm opened last Saturday the way it has for 40 years. Hector ran the yard. Sullivan told a customer, "You can't rush decomposition, same as you can't rush a good woman." The customer bought 4 bags. We sold out of the spring batch by noon. Real honey, single origin, Every jar certified. The label is new. I designed it at the kitchen table with a carpenter pencil. At the top, Elliston Hollow. Below, established by Edwin Elliston. And at the bottom, in my handwriting, tended by Cora. An older woman in a fleece vest held a jar to the light. "It tastes right again," she said. I said, "It does." Hector appeared at noon. "We're out of the clover. Should I put up the sold-out sign?" I said, "Use Grandpa's sign." He came back with a hand-painted board that read "Back next spring" in carpenter pencil. The letters were faded but steady. He hung it on the post, and we both stood looking at it. My stepmother has not spoken to me since March. My brother writes me a letter every month, handwritten, postmarked from the apartment above the feed store. He does not call them apologies. He calls them entries. I read every one and file them. The column is growing. I don't yet know what the balance will be, but the ledger is open. That's more than we had last year. On the hook by the hive gate, the brass smoker catches the morning light. It holds it the way copper holds warmth, longer than you'd think, and longer than it should, because some things don't let go of the heat they've carried, and some things shouldn't. Honey doesn't spoil Grandpa. I said to the East Hive row last Sunday, standing in his boots, in his grass, with his smoker in my hand. Neither did you. Here's what I know now that I didn't know 8 years ago. I was sitting in a used Honda with $1,100 a slow leak and a rear-view mirror full of a man who wouldn't wave me down, but wouldn't put his hand down either. Love you have to earn isn't love, it's an invoice. I spent 24 years paying installments on a debt that didn't exist. They were mailed to an address that was never going to send a receipt. If someone in your family taught you that being useful was the same as being loved, hear me. The ledger doesn't balance because it was never a real ledger. It was a loyalty test disguised as bookkeeping. The only way to pass it is to close the book, set it down, walk outside, and tend something that grows. If this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. Tell me what's the one thing your family never let you put your name on. I'll read everyone. Some girls finish first, but the ones who tend the garden are the ones still standing when the season turns, and the honey, the real honey, is always worth the wait.